So for the past, we did have some other preaching along with the Sermon on the Mount, so I'll put it this way. We had 25 or 26 sermons from the Sermon on the Mount. Half the year. Sitting at the feet of Jesus. And so when I come to the end of such an undertaking as the preacher in the equation, sometimes I'm left wondering where to go next. I have lots of canned sermons that I have done in the past, neatly stacked on their computer shelves. But I don't tend to open those cupboards. And I approach this work as a continuing creative process, and therefore, sometimes when a great burst of creativity has come to an end, I wonder what's next. And so I found myself wondering what's next. And I decided, since we're going into the book of Mark on Sunday mornings, maybe I'll take a story out of the book of Mark and preach on that. And it just so happens, I love this, happens all the time. It just so happens that a Christian friend of mine had sent me something via email that sparked an idea, which was to preach a lesson on the cursing of the fig tree in Mark chapter 11. And I thought, that would be pretty cool. So I started looking into that and researching that. But in the midst of it, something hit me. Because in the not too distant past, I had been studying some things about trees in the wilderness of Israel and certain lessons that those trees conveyed. And I thought, wait a minute. Here I've got this fig tree, and I have these other trees, and it sort of dawned on me to ask the question, what kinds of lessons does God teach us? And I'm sticking my neck out here, but I'm doing it with great boldness. What does He teach us through the plant life that we find in the Bible? And as a matter of fact, I hit something here, and I know what it is, but I think it's that. There we go. And as a matter of fact, when I thought about that fig tree, I realized that first of all, when you hear why Jesus cursed that fig tree and that whole story, you're never going to see it the same again. But one of the reasons for that is because I'm going to set that thing in its larger context. And we're going to be in a frame of thinking here for the next couple of weeks that perhaps you've never ever considered. You've seen glimpses of it, but to focus on this in the way that we're going to, it's just going to be life-changing, and enlightening is not the word. How am I doing for my selling job? Okay. So I'm going to ask you a question as we open. And that is, have you ever considered the subject of biblical botany? Botany is the study of plants. And as a matter of fact, at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, it is a required course for high-level Bible students to take this course, and there's a textbook, there's a man that wrote the book on it, and it is required reading for them to study biblical botany. And so you and I are going to take a course in biblical botany, and you are going to be just as fascinated and surprised as I am. And you're going to have God teaching you using plants. And the fig tree fits right in there as just as neat as can be. But when we can look at a story like that in that larger context, man, I tell you, it just blows your mind. So let's prepare to have our minds blown. Now, the lessons that we're going to be preaching here are going to be, see, I'm trying to get this thing to advance here, but okay. Oh, maybe I'll use this. Okay. Release the clicker. No? Okay. Yeah, don't worry about it. Yeah. Well, see if you can get it to advance, but yeah. Let's actually do that, but I'm not sure why it's not. Okay, thank you. Okay, very good. So the lessons are going to be under this title of Nothing But Leaves, and you may recognize that from Mark 11. But let's take that and we're going to be talking about nothing but leaves. We're going to be talking about dirt and roots and seeds and growth and thorns and thistles and bushes. And God's going to be teaching us through the whole thing. I mean, consider the parables of Jesus with me for just a moment. How much does Jesus teach us about the kingdom of God in the parable of the sower in Matthew 13? I mean, you want to know about the nature of God's kingdom and how God's kingdom spreads and how God's kingdom influences an individual and what the results of that look like. We can find it out there as we see a sower sowing seed. Or the parable of the growing seed in Mark 4, where a man goes out and plants a seed and he furnishes what it needs and he goes out there day by day. And then it begins to grow, and just the head, and then finally the full grain, and he brings out the sickle, and there's the harvest. Teaching us that the kingdom of heaven is like that. Or the parable of the mustard seed. Again in Matthew 13, how much do we learn through those stories? Not to mention the parable of the vine and the branches that we find in John chapter 15. The vine grower nurtures and provides for the needs of the vine. He cuts away branches that are not producing fruit in order to preserve the health of the vine. We learn that the vine grower never neglects his vine, as God never neglects his people. Concerned about people. Which brings me to Jonah's castor oil plant that grew up to give him shade when he was just being so angry about helping the people of Nineveh. And the plant grows up and Jonah's so happy. Oh, this is so nice. And he has that nice shade in that hot desert area. And then God sends the worm and the plant withers. And now he's all upset and mad. And God uses that plant to make the point. You're so upset because this plant withered. What about all these people? What about all those animals that are in danger of suffering horribly if they don't repent? How many times has God used plants and flowers and trees to teach us his lessons? Now again, as I talk about this, you just keep that old fig tree in mind, because we're going to get to that. But I'm just hopefully making this point. So what I thought I would do this morning is we're going to just talk about plants as amazing teachers. And as a matter of fact, we are going to be identified as some kind of plants. And we're going to see that as it comes up. So we're going to go through some things and just talk about how plants teach us. And one of the things as we begin is that plants don't set limits for themselves. Now again, God's going to call us a certain thing here in just a moment. And so you'll see how we're connected to all this. But think about Ephesians 4 for a moment and how Paul gives us that list of apostles and prophets and evangelists and pastors, teachers, etc., to equip the saints for the work of service. And as he ends that passage there in verse 13, he tells us that we are to grow up to a mature man, to the measure of the stature that belongs to the fullness of Christ. And so Jesus, of course, tells us in Luke 6:40, a passage that I quote often without any shame whatsoever, that the student is not above his teacher, but each one, when he's fully grown or fully trained, will be like his teacher. Well, what are the limits that God has placed upon us? Where does he want us to stop? Where does he want us to say that, okay, I've gone far enough, don't need to go any further, I'm enough like Jesus that I can just stop right here? No, we're not given any limits. We are encouraged to grow as much as we possibly can. And if you have bushes at home that need trimming on a regular basis, or grass that you got to cut on a regular basis, you know that plant life is going to grow as long as it can grow. And it's going to grow as big as it can grow. And if we want to have a certain look, then we're going to have to bring out the yard utensils and we're going to have to do some cutting, because they want to grow. Limiting beliefs about ourselves will hold us back from striving joyfully for this goal. Now, I want to take you to Luke chapter 4, and where Jesus in verses 18 and 19 goes back and quotes the prophet Isaiah. And he says here in verse 18, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set free those who are oppressed, to proclaim the favorable year of the Lord." That's from Isaiah 61. But I want you to listen to how that passage continues. In verse 2 of Isaiah 61, "To proclaim the favorable year of the Lord and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn, to grant those who mourn in Zion, giving them a garland for ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, the mantle of praise instead of the spirit of fainting, so they will be called." Remember, after Isaiah 54, he's talking about us. "And they will be called oaks of righteousness, the planting of the Lord, that he may be glorified." Woo! Oaks of righteousness, the planting of the Lord, that he may be glorified. That's who we're called. Does God teach anything using trees and plants? And another thing about plants is that they allow their struggles to make them stronger. And as far as the New Testament is concerned, the classic example of this in my mind is the Apostle Paul and his wrestling with that thorn in the flesh. And in verse 7, you'll be familiar with what he's talking about. You've heard these words, because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations. God is showing him things that are just out of the body, in the body, things that he wasn't even permitted to repeat. Because of the greatness of the revelations, and maybe the tendency to say, man, I must be really special for God to take me into the third heaven. So I would see and hear things that weren't even permitted for me to repeat. But be that as it may, for to keep me from exalting myself, there was given me a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me, literally to beat me. To keep me from exalting myself. Concerning this, I implored the Lord 3 times that it might leave me. And he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, I will rather boast in my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore, I am well content with weaknesses, with insults, with distresses, with persecutions, with difficulties, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. What God has planted, the oaks of righteousness that he has planted, allow their struggles to make them stronger. An oak that is exposed, or as it is exposed to the elements, digs in by growing thicker roots and a stronger trunk. It becomes stronger and more sturdy than one that would maybe be sheltered from the storms. So as we live, we experience successes and failures. But the struggles have the potential to make us stronger. I get that picture in my mind of that flower that has broken through the concrete. Just constantly pressing, until finally it breaks through. Okay? And so we have successes and we have failures, but we can be made stronger by them. I wonder if you think about those Christians that we read of in Acts 8, who in chapter 4, as a result of persecution, affliction, were scattered and went all over the place doing what? Preaching the word. They turned those hardships into benefit. And that is an attribute of plants. Another thing is that they turn toward the sun. I'm turning my Bible for a moment to 1 Corinthians chapter 3. Where Paul writes at verse 7, so neither the one who plants, oh, here we go again, neither the one who plants nor the one who waters is anything, but God who causes the growth. And then in verse 9 he says, for we are God's fellow workers, we are God's field. Literally, we are God's cultivated land. God's building. Down in Colossians 2, he talks about our growth, and he says that it is a growth which is from God. Those plants look toward the sun. They do not focus on the weeds and the predators that surround them. They bathe in the rays of the sun and they concentrate on their primary objective, which is growing. It made me think of the words in Luke chapter 1 that were spoken about John the Baptist. In verse 76, "And you, child, will be called the prophet of the Most High, for you will go on before the Lord to prepare his ways, to give his people the knowledge of salvation by the forgiveness of their sins, because of the tender mercy of our God, with which the sunrise on high will visit us." They look toward the sun. What are we told? Keep seeking the things above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on the things above, not on the things which are on earth. So they don't set limits for themselves. Struggles can make them stronger. They turn toward the sun. And plants are adaptable. They're adaptable. They have to adapt with the seasons. And their ability to adapt to those changes that are constantly coming help them to thrive. I always think about, and I did this morning, of that big maple tree that I go and there's two of them that give us all their leaves from our neighbor every year. Thank you very much. Nothing but leaves. But I watch that tree in its yearly cycle. Every day I'm out there and I just look at it. And now we've got a whole bunch of green leaves and an orange one here and an orange one there, but soon it'll be just a big blazing tree of fire-like orange and browns and beautiful. And then the wind will start blowing toward my yard, of course, every year. And those leaves will fall, and it'll be barren. There'll be nothing there. And all winter long, I go out there and I look at that barren tree. But if you look really close, there's these little teeny buds. The potential for its continuous thriving, season after season after season. They're adaptable. They accept the challenges in front of them, and they adapt accordingly. Paul's an example of that, of course, in Philippians 11, when he talked about how the Philippians had cared for him and provided for his needs. And we know these words, we've heard them so many times. "Not that I speak from want, for I have learned to be content in whatever circumstances I am." What God has planted, the planting of the Lord, the oaks of righteousness that he has planted in this world, adapt to circumstances as they change. So, if peace of mind is something that has been elusive to you, which I hope it has not, but let me add this, that peace is often found when we have an open mind to what life brings. Yeah, there are some things that we can't change. And we have to accept that, not be resigned to it. That's negative. Accept that. Embrace that. Let it be. But we also can decide to cultivate a life that we can enjoy anyway. Another thing about plants is that they add value to the lives they touch. As with many things, it's easy to take plants for granted, is it not? But from the oxygen we breathe to the fruits and the vegetables that keep us healthy, to the flowers that make us smile and say, "Oh, how beautiful." They add so much value to our lives. Over in the book of Hebrews in chapter 6 and verse 7, the writer says, "For ground that drinks the rain which often falls on it and brings forth vegetation useful to those for whose sake or for whose well-being it is also tilled, receives a blessing from God." So he's talking about the fruitfulness of our lives. And he uses the metaphor of a field and rain falling upon it and it producing food, medicinal plants, whatever it may be, that works to the well-being of those who harvest it. We all have long-term and short-term struggles in this life. And when we help others along the way, it adds another layer, of meaning to our lives. And knowing that, I go to 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 24, knowing that helping people along the way adds value to our lives. Peter says that all flesh is like grass. I think I might have the wrong reference there. 1 Peter 2, so maybe it's 2 Peter. But he says all flesh is like grass. Can we get away from this grass and trees and seeds? And all its glory like the flower of grass. The grass withers and the flower falls off. But the word of the Lord abides forever. And John tells us in 1 John 2:17, he who does the will of the Lord abides forever. So as you go out and live your life and you're going here and there and you're seeing these plants and these trees and these bushes, you're going to learn how to look at those things and go, yeah. They're happy being themselves. They don't need validation from the other plants to be who they are. They are happy. They are happy with the purpose that they have been given. In Acts chapter 13, just a little blurb where it says, as he's talking about Jesus and his resurrection and not undergoing decay, he says in verse 36, "For David, after he had served the purpose of God." After he had served the purpose of God, after he had served God or his generation let me shut up. For David, after he had served the purpose of God in his own generation, fell asleep and was laid among his fathers and underwent decay. But Jesus didn't undergo decay. The point is this: he had a purpose. And God's plants God's oaks of righteousness don't need validation. We are happy with the purpose that we have been given every day to serve the purpose of God in our generation, just as David did. And then, last but not least, lest you start saying this about me, plants move at their own pace. Okay. They react to the world around them, but they always move at their own pace. Now, sure, sometimes we may want things to go faster. Like that man in Mark chapter 4, he didn't go out and start yanking on that plant to get it to grow faster. He just went out there by day and by night, and he took care of it, and it grew. But the plant dictates the speed. And I'm over in the book of James in chapter 5, where James says in verse 7, "Therefore be patient, brethren." Be patient until the coming of the Lord. The rich had no regard for them. Sometimes they weren't paid for their labor. All kinds of things that the rich in this context are going to have to deal with as he tells them to weep and howl for their miseries, which are coming upon them. But he says, the farmer waits for the precious produce of the soil, being patient about it until it gets the early and late rains. You too be patient, brethren. You too be patient. Strengthen your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is near. So in their suffering, in their oppression by the rich, he goes to the farmer and to the field. And how the farmer is patient, waits for the rains to come. And he says, you learn from the farmer. And you be patient, because the day of the Lord, he said, is near. Well, how fascinating and full of pictures meant to teach us valuable lessons is the Bible. And if we can begin to start paying attention to the pictures, all of these pictures God has painted. Use your imagination. See these things. Ponder these things. And learn from them. So our agenda, as I close this morning, is eventually to ask the question, why did Jesus curse the fig tree in Mark 11, 12 through 25? And if you read Mark 11, 12 through 25, there's going to be the incident of Jesus cleansing the temple right in the middle. And you may be tempted to think, because he talks about the fig tree after that, to talk about those first verses about the fig tree, skip that and go down to what he says. It's all one. And you'll wonder, what does cleansing the temple have to do with him cursing that fig tree? It's got a whole bunch to do with it. So come on back. Come on back. Next week, we're going to go into the desert. And we're going to look at some plants and trees in the desert and what they teach. And then we're going to pull that old fig tree into the picture. And we're never going to see it the same again. Wow. Hey. If you've been listening this morning, you have a need. You have a need for prayer. You have a need, having become a disciple, to be baptized. There's water. But whatever it may be, we're here. At whatever capacity we can be of help. 24/7. As together we stand and sing our song. of encouragement.